All right, Chris and Tom, it looks like we are live now.
Okay. We'll give a couple minutes to see if our wayward council member finds his way in. There he is. He popped up as a guest.
There we go. If it's going to happen to anybody, it's going to happen to me.
Well, I'm glad you're in the meeting. Is everybody ready to get rolling?
I think so.
Okay. Let's go ahead and call the roll.
All right, Chair Rogers,
Here.
Member Schwethelm,
Here.
Member Sawyer.
Here.
Let the order reflect that all subcommittee members are present.
Okay. Sorry, my agenda is actually loading. 1 second. Okay, let's go ahead and start with public comments for non-agenda items. For folks who are in the meeting, if you have a public comment that you'd like to make, go ahead and hit the raise hand feature on Zoom. It's typically in the bottom right corner of the screen. All right, I'm not seeing any. Did we have any recorded voicemail public comments for today's meeting?
No, this subcommittee does not do voicemail public comments.
Great to know. We'll move on to item number 3, approval of the minutes. I know at least Councilmember Sawyer was able to open finally November 12th minutes. We heard about that earlier, John. Were there any changes that either of you had for the minutes?
No.
Okay, great. Then we'll show those as adopted or adopted as presented. Item number 4, city operations and maintenance budget.
So I'm going to be turning it over to Jan Mazik. Jan's our newly minted Chief Financial Officer, and we're really excited to have Jan on board. I would just like to thank her for all the work she's done to date, and actually thank Alan for all the work he did as the interim Chief Financial Officer. But welcome, Jan. Thank you for joining the team Santa Rosa, and you're going to be very impressed, council members.
Good afternoon, Mayor, council members. I am delighted to be here and nice to meet all of you, and I'll look forward to meeting you in person at some time. I think the goal of today is really to provide 2 things. One is a snapshot of where the city ended its mid-year in December, and begin the dialogue as to, short and medium term strategies, financial and operating strategies that may frame our outlook ahead of next week's goal setting process. And so Alan will deliver the presentation. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to him, and then I'll return to talk at the end about, perhaps what some of those strategies might be. Thanks.
All right, well, good. The thing's going up. Next slide, please. And Jan's already covered this mostly, so let's hop into the next slide. So these are a lot of these are what we went over on Tuesday. This is just to set the context for the further conversation that we would have at the end of the presentation. And then if there's any questions that come up from this that maybe you thought about since Tuesday, we're here to answer those as well. But as you recall, these are our baseline forecast charts. We had the top one shows where we were forecasting in April of 2020 when we called management partners in to help us look on how the COVID-19 potential recession would affect us, and loss of revenues and all that. And they were also looking at it in terms of the expiring sales tax measures that would start in fiscal year 25 through 27. So then the council made some adjustments during that budget process, and one of which was to maintain a general fund vacancy amount of about $5 million, and then also to return some unused project dollars in the general fund back to the general fund reserves. Those were meant to be short-time measures to bring our reserves back to some sort of comfort level, knowing that we were going to need to draw down greatly from the reserves in order to pass the current year budget. Next slide, please. So one of the things from that we showed yesterday and that management partners went through in greater detail back in September were 4 scenarios that they had. Again, they had 3 main assumptions: that the vacancy amount would be there, that those $10 million of reserves would stay in the unassigned reserves, and that we would renew all 3 tax measures. And then they developed some other scenarios based on the use of, or potential use of, PG&E dollars to augment the 10 million that already was brought back to the reserves. And in doing so, it would provide some time to allow us to kind of right the ship, if you will. Otherwise, you're looking at cuts immediately. And so this is where we would have, if we use at the time $30 million of the PG&E money, there would be no immediate budget reductions needed and no immediate ones needed. But then as we move down that level from 20 to 10 to none of the PG&E money, there is cuts that would need to happen, starting at $1.5 million in this next fiscal year, so fiscal year 21-22, all the way down to, I believe it was $8 million in 21-22 if we use none of the PG&E dollars. Next slide, please. And so I think what this illustrates is that we're clearly do not want to use PG&E dollars for ongoing, but what we were looking at was a way to kind of shore up the problem and allow us to come up with a strategy to react to this. And you know, obviously, if we needed to cut $8 million in a year, it's going to have a pretty significant jolt to the operation or to the organization. Next slide, please. So, you know, one of the things that I talked about on Tuesday is, so here we are at mid-year, how do we look? And as I mentioned, we did dip into reserves. The costs that we needed to provide up front for COVID relief, especially for our homeless community, was obviously a lot greater than what we expected. And there were other needs that we pulled out of reserves to the tune of $8.7 million. And then what we found is that while we were maintaining our $5 million of permanent salary vacancies in the general fund, unfortunately, operating needs and you know, the glass fire, other emergency events that we just seem to not be able to shake, also aid into that, because we needed to do more overtime, and that, of course, would, as we project out, would eat into that salary savings. So just to kind of illustrate that, I didn't do it on Tuesday, but just to keep in the back of your mind is we look at just the straight overtime, not the strike team overtime or the other ones like that, holiday overtime, but just your straight overtime. The general fund was at about, had spent about 87% of its budget by the end of December. So you can guess that there's not a good likelihood. In fact, actually, we had that atmospheric river come through us, which was an EOC activation, and that probably drew some more overtime as well. I know the fire department upstaffed, a lot of that comes off of overtime. So the odds that we are going to be able to maintain our overtime budget through the end of this fiscal year are non-existent. We will blow past that. And that is why, that's how we're getting our estimates that we are going to eat into that salary savings.
Alan, can I need to interrupt you just for a second.
Sure.
And I missed this. I wanted to mention it the other night, but I thought it was probably better left to the subcommittee. Could you go back to the slide, the prior slide, just the one right above this one? See in the comment under the 10 million of the 95 million, trade-off is that higher PG&E use reduces level of cuts. Could you add in PG&E fund use? Because when I first read that, and I know it seems simple, but I was confused as to how does using more PG&E reduce the level of cuts? So if you could just add fund in there, if anyone were to read that like I was reading it, they would be confused. So I know it's a simple thing, but if you could do that, I appreciate it.
I think we'll call it settlement. We'll call it the settlement, PG&E settlement.
However you can get that word in there would be great.
Forgive our shorthand on that. But,
that's okay, no problem. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Make that.
All right.
So, so on the positive side, we were in November able to extend 2 of our quarter-cent sales taxes for 10 years. So that is a good thing. We still have the public safety special tax that will expire in 2025. Yeah, 2025. And right now, I believe the long range forecast has the assumption that if that tax isn't extended, that those costs would go into the general fund. It's just an assumption that we have in there. We can talk more about that on March 11th when Management Partners is here to go through the long range forecasts, and then we can get into what that looks in terms of an ongoing assumption. Next slide, please. So, and again, just briefly, what we wanted to do was illustrate some of the things that pop up that affect our reserves in a given year. And like I said before, our given years are turning to be more, regular, unfortunately. But we knew that we were going to pull down money from reserves to plug the gap in our structural deficit. But then on top of it, we had, what is that, about $9.2 million that we pulled out of the reserves for both COVID response and glass fire response. So, anyway, so what it does is it just exacerbates the problem that we have going through, and it makes it more difficult to address the next year because the structural deficit still exists and we're running out of the funds that we can use to plug it.
And Alan, I apologize to jump in and interrupt. You have on this slide 9.2 million used from the reserves due to the glass fire and COVID.
Yeah.
Earlier, it said due to COVID, it was 8.7 million was used. Is this a more updated one, or was the 8.7 what we think is reimbursable?
The 8.7 was more of a total cost. So that is a response that includes existing appropriations.
Okay,
so
thank you.
Impacts to those. This is specifically what we pulled out of reserves.
So the 8.7 was largely allocated, and then on top of the 8.7 was 9.2, or there's overlap between those two figures?
No, the overlap would be 8.7 is the total amount of the impact for COVID. 7.4 of it we had to pull out of reserves.
Thank you.
The remaining
That makes
amount
sense.
was allocated.
Great, thank you.
All right, next slide, please. So then this gets us to our reserves as we are seeing it from where we began the fiscal year, or where we ended last fiscal year, at $23.8 million in reserves, or $2 million under our policy mandate. We pulled money out, including the 18, the 8.7 that came out, and then you have some turn back coming back, and again, that is what we are thinking that might be what is left of the $5 million of salary savings. There are some funds that we set aside, and in case we that we didn't need to use, because we extended all the contracts without increases due to the uncertainty of where we were with COVID. And then we're thinking that as a total amount, and I know we talked about this a little bit on Tuesday, but as a total general fund revenue, bolstered by where we think there might be some more positive revenue coming in on sales tax, our property tax being strong, that we think that we might, right now we're projecting that we could have $3 million more than what we estimated. So when we do the math on that, we're left with about $5 million in reserves. Again, it's a mid-year projecting out to the end of the year. Basically, the way that we do that is that we assume the budget or the expenditures are going to equal budget, unless we can tell for sure that we're going to go over in a certain area. So like I said, the overtime, we know that that's going to go over budget, so we can kind of figure that in. But for the most part, we would do any projections of reserves on a mid-year on a budget basis. So that's what you have there. Next slide, please. So in here, where we've kind of had it as part of an overall use of PG&E money to stabilize the organization, here what we're basically saying is that it is very important that we use that in order to essentially balance our budget for fiscal year 21-22. And I think the next slide is when Jan will come in, and she's going to talk about where we kind of go from there. We have a very strong philosophy and drive in our finance department. Those aren't the greatest choices of words, but anyway, we know that whatever we use to plug a gap, it's got to be for only one-time use. So we have a dire need for money to come in to plug that gap in reserves to allow us to pass our budget. That is it. We need to make changes during the year that makes it to where we don't have to rely on anything like that anymore. This is supposed to be emergency need. But with that, we're looking at $40 million. That's the aggregate of the 30 million that Management Partners had in September, plus the around almost $10 million that we've pulled out through the first half of this year, kind of gets to the 40 million. Obviously, if not all of that is needed, you know that it's still in that can go back into the pot for other community needs. But this is what our estimate is at this point. So it's kind of a starting place. And like I said, in March 11th, Management Partners will be back. They'll have a revised long-range forecast based on mid-year amounts, and they may have a different outlook. Next slide. And I believe, yes. And so with this one here, looking at our strategies, let's have Jan come in and kind of take us to the end of the presentation.
You know, before I delve into either the short-term or medium-term strategies, it probably would be helpful for me just to sort of paint a broader perspective. So I think luckily, after I'd been at the city for a week, I really had to take a deep dive into financials, into prior budget performance, and come up with an assessment of where, just from my view, where I thought we were. And to provide a little bit broader perspective on what I'm going to talk about, you know, one of the things that I really heavily rely on is what does historical data look like? Because historical data frequently is indicative of future performance and puts information in context. Meaning, what trends are we on? Are they upward, downward, or fluctuating? And so, I mean, I took away my own perspectives of where I thought trends were headed. And, you know, even notwithstanding COVID, the fires, there were certain emergent trends that were present. If you went back and said, looked at 5-6 years ago, and what that what that portended, if you will. And so even then, you know, there were divergent streams of revenues and expenditures. Expenditures were trending up, revenues were trending downward. And so it probably would be helpful to talk about financial condition a little bit. And financial condition in whether it be Santa Rosa or other governments in California, and frankly, in other places around the world, is impacted by a number of factors. It's impacted by environmental, fiscal, organizational, policies, decisions, and actions. And the results of all of those show up in a variety of ways, whether it be budget balancing challenges, service levels, susceptibility to other socioeconomic forces, adjustments to those forces, as well as demographic changes and business cycle impacts. And I think you can see examples of all of those in the city. And while we may address each of those issues very differently and individually, they really all converge financially. And I think, as I said, we see those evident forces already at play in Santa Rosa. But with that in mind, I think it will be important to strengthen, you know, budgetary, fiscal, and financial practices with the intent that those practices enable the ability for stronger execution of priorities across city departments. I think what that means is it means, you know, rebuilding reserves, balancing recurring expenditures from recurring revenues rather than one-time revenues, providing timely information, meaning the finance department, to be used for decision-making, meaning that we're afforded the opportunity to make some express decisions, meaning, are we going to stay the course or do we need to take corrective action? And I think the mid-year going forward is what we should see, what we should do at this point in time next year. And so with that, we're not going to turn this around overnight. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's going to take a little bit of effort. But I do think there are some short-term and immediate strategies that we should think about, whether it's repatriating revenues, a commitment to how we balance expenditures. I think the cost structure that we currently have is really unaffordable and untenable over the longer term. I think as we think about how we use the other PG&E monies, we should see require criteria and quantitative supporting analyses that matches with the project. So whether it be we're considering one of two choices or alternative choices, that's one set of analysis. If we're thinking, for instance, of the fire station, that's a different sort of analysis. But I think somewhere in the prioritization, how those funds get used, I think should be based on highest and best use. And then I think on the operating side of the business, I think we need to, think about what corrective measures look like, whether it be, do we need to reestablish a budget baseline and, sort of know with certainty what that run rate looks like, so that we can make some shorthand decisions. Revenue stress testing under certain scenarios, whether it be 5%, 10%, or some other percentage, what does revenue performance, look like under different scenarios? One of the things I think you should expect, and I'm committed to doing that, and is that we have, periodic financial assessment that is aligned with the health and the needs of the city. I've also spent some time speaking with management partners and talking about their views on some of these issues and realizing that in the state of California, raising revenues are impossible. I think the only sustainability we get on that end relates to, assessment of our own tax and fee policies, as they're more likely to be sustainable than anything else. I think we do other things that, augment how we make decisions about spending. Constant examination, obviously, of spending plans, but, looking at fleet capital replacement, how we replace, other assets, how we keep our assets, in good repair. And how we routinize other work. Are there technologies, for instance, we ought to be taking advantage of post-COVID? And how do we make those investments on an ongoing basis? We're not, this isn't a decision to be made today or probably even in goal setting, but just I think in terms of thinking about some of the things we should think about. One, immediately, meaning in the current budget year, and then looking forward medium term. And I see the city manager, and with that, I'll turn it over to him.
And just following what Jan, I think this should be refreshing news for the three of you. I think this is the sort of work that you've been looking to do in this committee. I think it's going to change significantly what we're bringing to you. So you're hearing that there's going to be a more regularized report out on the fiscal condition. What we're going to need assistance with your colleagues is understanding that we need to address that structural issue. And that structural issue is going to be difficult because there are revenue ways to address it. But going back to some of the conversations we've talked about before about policy-driven decision-making that sets criteria that looks at the health of our revenues and looks at the condition and the needs around of our expenditures. So I think to me, this is exactly where we need to go. I think it's the message that I've heard repeatedly from this group, which hasn't changed substantially over the period of time. Most of you have participated over the last few years. And I'm really excited about Jan bringing that kind of discipline to us and us figuring out how we bring that discipline to the entire organization and to your colleagues on the council, because it is going to be a significant change. We've gotten in a habit that was also continued by the needing to shore us up during emergencies of not thinking in those terms. And we really have to start thinking in those terms for the long-term health and actually being able to right the ship so that we can do additional work in the community. So I think to me, it's really refreshing. It's going to be change. It's going to change the dynamic in this room. And I know staff is excited about it. It's probably going to be change in our basic processes around how we build a budget moving forward. So I'm excited to get started. I think this was a preview of that. You're going to get some more work, and I'm hoping that work matches up, that we don't have any more emergencies between now and the beginning of the budget cycle, so we can synchronize the conversation with this group with the larger budget questions, right? So that really the work we're doing supports that, and you can help us make sure that the community and the council understands this work that's taking place in this committee. And we're open for questions. I don't think Jan, is that the conclusion of the presentation? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
I appreciate your comments, Mr. City Manager, and to your point that you were making, that is why I kept this committee the same from last year going forward. Is I do know from having conversations with both of the other council members that we all do have a very similar philosophy on righting the ship. And in fact, that's a lot of my notes and questions that we'll get to, Jan, if you don't mind. I see Councilmember Sawyer has unmuted, and so I'll go to him first, and then I'll come to Councilmember Sweathelm, and then I've got a couple of additional questions.
Thank you, Mayor. And what I hope is a fairly simple question, and I am excited about the changes in how we function, not only as a subcommittee, but as a council as well. It will force us to behave differently. What I hear you saying in this sense, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that we will actually be able to use some form of litmus test when making expenditure decisions.
I think that it will help prioritize I think that more rigorous analyses will help in the prioritization of decisions, use of finite resources, which cash and budget are. And I think that really is the goal. What can we get done? Is it affordable? Is it doable? But I think the sort of analyses that one gets should be helpful in framing the decision or the right decision to come.
And the reason I ask that is because oftentimes, and we'll come up with a budget, and then as the year progresses, things come up, and unless there are emergency things, sometimes I think there's a tendency for council to spend money that it doesn't have, or that it wasn't planning on spending in the first place. And how to keep that reality in front of the council throughout the year is challenging, because the community comes forward, and what sounds like relatively small amounts of money when that were unexpected and unbudgeted, when they come up throughout the year, it can add up quickly. And so what concerns me sometimes is that we end up spending fairly reasonably large sums of money that once added up throughout the year that we had not really planned on spending. And being able to keep that reality of being fiscally responsible in front of the council on a fairly regular basis I think will help with that. And it's kind of a constant reminder that this action that you're about to take is going to cost X number of dollars potentially, and that is going to compromise your ability to do other certain things that you actually budgeted for, and now you're changing your mind in the middle of the game. It's those kinds of expenditures that tend to concern me throughout the year after our budget exercise.
I can certainly appreciate that. And look, the reality is there are certain things that are going to come up, but there are things that come up that probably really shouldn't come up, if we all, gave. What you want the budget process to be is a well thought out business plan for the departments for each year. But that planning has to take place in front of the budget process, and the budget really should reflect, what that work plan is for the year. I think if that is done, that will help. That won't solve everything, but I think it will be helpful. And I don't know that budgets frequently get put together with that sort of precision that one might like them to have. But I think that's part of the answer. But I think part of the other answer is, when people come to the council, I think it should be framed, they should be able to frame, hey, what are my alternative funding sources? Have you sort of worked this out in the departments with the city manager, with the CFO or the budget manager, whomever. And, it shouldn't sort of be, here's what we're going to do. And it sort of puts people on the spot of having now to go back and sort through that. So I think, it's probably not a straightforward answer. I think it's a combination of things, but I also think it's sort of practice that, certainly habits we need to do a little bit differently. And I would, venture that it's probably all of the above. But I'm really a big believer that, whatever the spending priorities of the city council is for the year, the budgets really ought to reflect that and a plan for execution. And then, at the end of the fiscal year, we ought to be talking about, hey, did we accomplish what we set out to accomplish? Why didn't we? And, have that discussion. And, it can't always be about something else came up if you've given a lot of thought a forefront. So those are my thoughts on it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Councilmember Sweathelm.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Jan, for this presentation and for your comments, Mr. City Manager. and Sean, you did hit the nail on the head. This is music to my ear is what I'm looking for. And the one challenge to go along with what Mr. Sawyer just brought up, sometimes we're our own worst enemy. And when I'm saying we, it's the 7 of us sitting on council, because I can count probably the last 3 council meetings. We approved over $500,000 worth of things that didn't fit in any budget. And there's always that little line that I know the city manager and staff puts in there. This is coming from the general fund reserve. And I'm just wondering if there, Mr. City Manager, if we could highlight that, put some flashing stars on it, is that we did not talk about this and there's a consequence for that. Because I know I frequently said to Mr. City Manager, if we being council ask you to do something that isn't on that priority list, it's got to have an impact, Jan. And that's what I heard you talking about. It's an impact to the budget or the workload priority of our staff. And I think sometimes council, especially live, we act like whether or not it's funny money, here's a compelling reason to get it. But if we take these individually versus what you're talking about, the budget process as a whole, we need to have our systems down pat and recognize that if we change this process, and we'll see what goes on the 18th and 19th, that should really be our roadmap moving into the future. And I do appreciate, and I really don't have any questions. I'm just affirming that I like this process, and I am interested in getting more feedback or more meetings of this group, and then the 3 of us can report out at council, we've got this process. We need to be on the same page, because if we start, you know, if 4 of us decide to go one direction, I get the position the city manager's in, I can count to 4 out of 7 means we're going in that direction. And we have to, I think, recognize and honor the process that we've all agreed to during these financially challenging times. So sorry, Chris, no questions, just kind of editorializing.
No, that's totally fine. I do have some questions, Jan, and Alan, because I know, Alan, you've been doing a lot of the pre-work on this. And to Councilmember Sweathelm's point, I did want to verify the 1.2 million that we're expecting for Cahoots. That's not allocated anywhere in the budget, correct? That would come out of the reserves, or it would come out of the next year's budget. We'd have to find that 1.2 million.
So I think this is what Jan's, so what we need to have is a process where we do the analysis, right? I think sometimes we get into a question about where the funding located, and we haven't gone back and done the business analysis that we need to do to set the framework. So we get caught up in where is that coming from, as opposed to getting the direction and having a process that allows us to address it. So
I
understand. Yeah, but it's not, but right now I would say that's what we're doing, is we're trying to do the business analysis on the program so that we can understand where it fits, because there may be, the public just wants, we know there are public members who just say, either make it come from the police budget or don't add to the police budget. We got to do the business analysis on the product so that we can assign it to a place in the budget. So I'm going to say it could come from, right now, traditionally what we've done is exactly what you said. Go to reserves, move it from reserves. We're talking about a business planning process that may come back with a different answer than the one you've just asked.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that. My question is, until we have this process in place, is it going to continue to operate the way that it has in the short term?
Culture change takes time. So we're talking about business modeling. So that's why we got to use some of this to make some of the changes now, but it is going to be an ongoing process to make change.
Okay. Go ahead, Alan.
Well, and just to kind of on where the money is, we did, when we brought police down to baseline, we did put that aside. So that's about 900,000 of whatever. And so that is something that wouldn't need to be pulled directly out of reserves, that would be there for.
Again, Alan's slipping back into the old model. What I think we need to do is here's where we want to go as an organization. How do we structure our business to meet the need? And so that's why it's a longer event horizon to do budget processes. As Jan said, it takes more time because you have to start building that work up front. Our traditional answer is we set this money aside, we've gone here, and it starts to get us into fiscal issues long term. If the challenge is how do we integrate this service, and again, I think this is why questions about where calls for service come from, what are we driving, what costs we're doing. I will tell you, this is also the exact conversation I had with the team on homelessness right now about the study session. We're going to have to change how we look at data and how we look at business planning to address these issues, which I think will help some folks. But that doesn't happen overnight, because we've got a system that I'm sure the former chief can tell you doesn't necessarily work that way. It may work in some departments that way, but this is an organizational change. And that's why we're saying we're going to need your help to reinforce that organizational change, because we're so locked into that pattern of exactly that question, Mayor.
Okay, I appreciate that. So looking at current budget, and Jan, we'll get to future. Looking at current budget, I am breaking it up into 2 different categories, and I appreciated the way that you talked about this. One is the ongoing sustainability of your operational budget, dollars in, dollars out. And then the other is how to utilize your one-time dollars as well as your reserves, needing to maintain and build back up your reserves. So there is potential for the federal dollars. How does that calculus change the request from finance of the 40 million from the PG&E settlement funds?
So the city manager is going to say not at all, because we don't know the details of the federal requirement. We have to know what the details on the federal requirement are. Then we can bring that question back to this group about where the change should be. But right now, we don't know what the requirements are and what the agencies are going to require. There are questions about whether it can even be spent on things such as investments in communities. Those are real questions, right? So we all know the devil's in the details with the federal government. I'm hoping to get some more certainty on that front going into goal setting, but until we know it, we're going to have to say money's coming, but what are the restrictions? And then we're going to have to come back and have that conversation. It is speculative.
And I'm glad that that's the answer that you gave, because what I'm worried is going to happen is, as we start to see in the press, 35 million, 34 million, whatever it's going to be coming to Santa Rosa, I don't want to commit the false expectation to the public that what we've said is that the 40 million from PG&E is now back on the table.
And you well know what's going to happen is, even if that ends up being the number, it's going to have to go to Treasury, and then Treasury is going to have to determine how quickly it goes out the door. No matter what the 60-day turnaround is, what the reality is going to be very different than what the directive is, right? And so even in the timing, it's going to be a question. Even once we know the rules, there's going to be some real questions about timing.
Okay. And then, Alan, I asked you the other night, and I do think it's something that I'd like to discuss here at some point, and Mr. City Manager, of what is the expected return for reimbursements for all of the different disasters that we've front loaded. And understanding we're talking about a 5-10 year horizon for some of that reimbursement to come back to the city. I'm sure John thought in 2008, man, 10 years from now, it's going to be so much easier for people to budget. And I'm sure thinking about how much we've expended and knowing some of that will come back and go appropriately back into the reserves, I think is going to be a conversation that I'm interested in having. Again, divorced from the conversation about your ongoing budget, your ongoing revenues. That's coming back to us as a one-time fund that can go into our reserves and help build that. So I'm interested to see what that number might look like.
And I think we're going to start to get it. That's one of the assignments that I've asked Jan and Alan and Jason to take a closer look at. We'll make a pass at that on the 23rd. I mean, there's an update coming. But again, one of our education points is going to be that the timing on that is incredibly speculative. Right. That the timing is, that's where the unknown lies in all of these questions.
Yeah, I don't see that as something that today we'd use to project out any types of changes in our one-time funding. To me, that's one of the wild cards. To John's point, mid-year adjustments that could come in that we'd be discussing at the point that those dollars come in, kind of a thing. Not necessarily to be spent, but in anticipation as they come in, surprise dollars, which are always a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Jen, my understanding is that property taxes typically lag about 2 years behind sales tax. When there's a shift in the economics, that in recessions, usually they're about 2 years behind. I heard Alan say that we actually think we might be 3 million ahead going in this year from what we actually budgeted or expected. Should we also start to prepare to see that dip in the next couple of years? Or is the COVID crisis so far, what you're seeing from other jurisdictions, not impacting property values?
Do you want me to take that one, Jan? we're not seeing it impacting other jurisdictions right now. A lot of the things that happened in the last recession so far aren't turning up. However, there is concern over, depending on what relief comes for people to help with mortgages. Obviously, that's going to be a thing that you're going to want to look at and all that to try to project out into the future. But right now, what we're seeing is that for the most part, property values are staying high. Building activity outside of COVID, when they're allowed to do it, it seems to be going well. People are doing work around the house. Interest rates are low, so I think they are taking advantage of that. So for the near term, we're not seeing it, but obviously we are always looking. I think one of the forums that we went to, the Sonoma County ones, is that you always keep an eye on building permits, and when you see those things starting to trend downward, that's when you start getting worried, because now you're seeing a stall. We just haven't quite seen that where I would be really concerned right now.
Okay, great. And then my last question is about pensions, and on two fronts. One is for this year's budget. What I know each year, sort of, we see an additional obligation on the city to increase costs. What are we projecting the increase is coming into this next year? And Jan, you coming in and taking a look, I'm sure. What can you give us your thoughts on sort of long-term, how we meet that sustainability point, and understanding that it's broader than just us, that it's the whole system? It's sort of where we sit in terms of, do we know what percentage of funded our pension obligations are now?
Alan, I don't know that I know that with any exactness.
Yeah, and Chris, oh, sorry, Jan, I didn't mean to step over, but I'm going to need to get back to you on that. So in the March meeting, we'll have that information. I just don't have it off the top of my head. I know that we have the valuations are there. I don't have it right in front of me right now, and I wouldn't want to hazard a guess.
Yeah, if you could, that'd be great. I have it in my head from a couple of years ago when we pre some of these fires and pre the pandemic. I know we had a 10-year horizon to finding some leveling off of the pension obligations for the city. And I'm wondering just sort of how potential recession or drop in economics could impact it, though I do also recognize the stock market's doing fine, which is where a lot of that return comes from for the city.
Look, what we'll do is we'll get some sort of an explainer. Oh, you know what? If you promote Shelley Riley, she could answer that question.
I'm sure Shelley is thrilled.
She's throwing me the rescue line.
Given that she just saved you, what are you going to promote her to?
Probably.
So PERS rates are doing a couple of things. The normal retirement rates we saw actually go down for miscellaneous, police, and fire. Unfortunately for us, the unfunded liability payments are still going up. For miscellaneous, they went up about 11%. For fire, they went up 10%. Police, they went up 16.5%. So next year we're looking at, and this is citywide, I'm not being exclusive to the general fund. So we're looking at about $29 million. Last year we paid about 25. So a significant increase. And I don't see those UALs. I don't know off the top of my head, because like Alan, I don't have that PERS rate in front of me, but those will continue to increase at least for a couple more years before we actually start seeing any sort of significant dip in them.
Okay. I really appreciate it, Shelley. It's one of the things that I'm trying to just keep an eye on as well when we talk about long-term sustainability, is that crowds out our ability to provide more service, right? And so how do we keep an eye on that, or keep control of that to the extent that we can, and how do we meet that sustainability point? When we talk about, Jan, when we talk about long-term sustainability, I'm talking about all of those components. And I'm sure from what I'm getting from you is that you are too.
I am. And I don't think I've said this out loud, but one of the things that, in fact, I think Alan and I are going to participate on a call tomorrow, is whether or not, I think now you can sort of take out discrete maturities with CalPERS. I haven't spent a lot of time talking about it or looking at it, but our call tomorrow does relate to that. And whether or not we'd be better off sort of, I don't know how we'd make the trade on monies, but whether there's any value to some of the monies being taken out that expensive, because the CalPERS amortization is very expensive, actually, relatively speaking to other things. And so it's one of the things we'll look at. I can't answer that right now, but we'll circle back on it, whether or not it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. And one of the things that I have in my head, and I apologize, I didn't prepare to talk too much about this, so I might get some of this wrong, but I do remember that this group did a year or two ago had an opportunity with some leftover pension obligation bond dollars to pay down some one-time to get rid of some of the amortized owings. Is that how you'd put it? I'm not quite sure how to phrase it. And that was one thing that we were very supportive of, was one-time investment in dollars to then long-term owe a little bit less year over year. So I know it's something that we would be supportive of. That's all I've got. So I appreciate that. Any other comments or questions, John or Tom? Any final comments, Mr. City Manager? All right, Jan, well, I really appreciate you coming on here. I'm looking forward to getting to work with you a little bit. I'm pretty excited by this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Chief.
So we'll go on. I guess I should also see if there's any public comments.
I was going to say, wait.
I sometimes forget we provide enough commentary, but other people like to be engaged as well. I'm seeing no hands, so I'll move on to item number 5, and that's the next meeting agenda items. Now, Mr. City Manager, did you have ideas for the next items, or did you want to hear from us what we would like?
I think we're gonna program it, and I think that's we have the presentation from management partners, correct? That's the big item. So that's where we would like to spend the focus of the period of the time.
That works for me. Anything, John or Tom?
Well, just for me, coming up on our goal setting to actually implement, and if this slide number 10, some of these different strategies get shared with our colleagues, and I'm not sure how much of this information will be shared during the 18th and 19th, but this looks great on paper. But when we actually start talking about projects and costs and the reality of making some of these decisions, those are the conversations I'm looking forward to.
And I think we'll get to that in the budget process. I would be pleased to bring the slide somewhere in the deck, and you all could talk about the work that you're planning to do with us on that front. I think that would be good, and we'll bring the slide along. Priority setting is priority setting, but I do want to make sure that they understand that we're going to begin this work this year in the budget process. So we'll figure out how to integrate it into the presentation. We won't probably spend hours on it, but we will make sure it's there. Okay.
I'm just a big believer, as you mentioned several times, it's a culture shift. Yep. And we can only move at the speed at which the shift can change, and we can absorb that change. So even just planting seeds and then continuing to reinforce that, I think will lead us to success. So the
And
sooner the
it'll
better.
afford me an opportunity to introduce Jan to the rest of the council at that time too. So we'll make sure that's included.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and just really fast too, on the goal setting, we did create space, as we talked about on Tuesday, for us to talk about utilization of the PG&E funds on a couple of the items that the council seemed ready to move forward on. Alan and Sean, is this request for the 40 million for the reserves? Did you get the direction you need from council on Tuesday, or do we need to discuss it?
I think we need to discuss it just to make sure we're all on the same page, because I think everyone was I'll just say, by the time we got there, there was probably a little weariness in the room. And so I would request that we confirm that that's the way we go ahead. So there's no confusion moving forward. Understanding after sitting through 5 hours of a very, very important but challenging conversation, I think it'd be good to repeat.
We'll make sure that we drill down on that point. I did talk with the facilitator today and told him that I thought that we needed more than a half hour for the discussion about the PG&E funds.
Yes, he said, yep, absolutely.
Hey, Chris, just to follow up on that, on the paying down PERS thing, we did pay down, I forget the exact amount. I think it was around 3 million or so that was left over from a pension obligation bond. We did do a payment on that. It lowered our UAL about $700,000. Right. So
great, thank you, Alan.
Yep.
John.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm hoping that in both our priority setting and our budget setting, that we do not hold back the finance department from cautioning the council strenuously and very, very clearly and realistically about our realities. In my 14 years on the council, I've never seen a $5 million reserve number. I used to think it was scary when we got, anywhere in the teens, and being where we are now, it gives me no small amount of anxiety. And to our new council members who are not used to, who it's all new to them, and we need to very quickly educate them on our fiscal reality. And so my recommendation is don't hold back. And you can stay just this side of scaring everyone, but maybe a little fright would do us all a little good.
I'm never shy about frightening, but it would be helpful to have some support network for us in that conversation. That's why I'm asking what I asked of the members of this subcommittee.
And
absolutely.
John, the phrase that I heard earlier today is that the Christmas tree can't hold any more ornaments.
That's good. I think the Christmas tree is looking a little bit.
Should we provide the visual? Do you want a big tree with lots of ornaments, or the Charlie Brown tree with
Charlie Brown tree? That's what I was gonna say. Without getting in front of any trademark issues, which they're very strenuous about.
Well, I'm certainly glad we can end this meeting with some laughs, because the rest of it wasn't too funny.
No.
Right. True.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll go ahead and adjourn then, and we'll see you in goal setting.
Thank you.
Thank you all.